Mic's on?
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. Really appreciate it. Big thanks to Arnolfini as well for letting us use this space, and a guy called Ben who helped me set it up as well is like broken his elbow on the day, so he couldn't be here. But yeah, so we're not filming this one as well because just because the subject matter is quite sensitive as well, and we want like to encourage a bit of audience participation. I think it's nice to like not be on camera all the time. And then what I might try and do as well is for those people who feel a little bit more shy or whatever and don't want to like speak up necessarily, I'm going to have the Mandem Facebook Messenger just open in front of me. So if anyone just wants to like shoot a question or whatever, I can ask it to the panel and all of that. Big apologies that Will Smith couldn't make it. Like I called him, he just wasn't on it. I think he was too nervous. But we've got Vicaas here, and he is a beautiful replacement. So what I do now is, if you lot all just want to say a quick, a little bit about yourselves and why this conversation is important to you. Starting with Daniel.
Cool. Good evening, everyone. My name is Daniel Edmund. I am a TEDx speaker and former assistant curator for TEDx Bristol. I run my own company called Milk for Tea, which deals with men's masculinity and well-being. And this is, right along the work that I do. And really thankful to you, Elias, for creating this space for us to speak openly about these issues as it pertains to masculinity for men of color. And really looking forward to being here and looking forward to hearing what you all have to say as well.
Hi everyone, my name's Olamiposi. I'm from Ireland, currently in Bristol studying filmmaking, and I'm also working on a platform to help young artists really find themselves and step out of their comfort zones. And I guess I'm a bit scared, I'm not gonna lie. A lot of faces in the audience, but it'll be fun. Yeah, it'll be cool.
Hi, my name's Vicaas. I'm like Bristol born and bred. At the moment, I'm like a part-time East African and Somali literature student. What brings me here today is I'm particularly interested around conversations concerning masculinity when it comes to men of color, because I think mainstream discourse around masculinity really centers around like cisgendered white men. So I think the narratives of men of color often get lost in that. So I think it's important that we speak for men of color, like from first-hand experience.
Hello, my name's Vincent Baidoo. I am a transmedial producer, so I make films, music, comics, animations, and games. Been teaching since a very early age as well, mentoring, that sort of stuff. So the reason why I think that this conversation is important for me is just because there's a lot of distractions and a lot of conversations that are continuously going, but this is definitely one of the more fringe conversations where I think that, whereas you can kind of spiral around certain topics, I think this is definitely one that needs to be explored in conversation first so that we can start making some actionable changes, basically.
So a little bit about why the conversation is important to me. I didn't actually plan on actually sort of divulging into the conversation about masculinity, but starting this platform has kind of led me to do that. And I've learned quite a lot recently. I've done a bit of research on my dissertation. I've been working on something focused on masculinity. So before we get started with all of this, I just want to read out a little excerpt from my dissertation, and it kind of includes like a mixture of quotes from other people as well. But I'll just read it out just so we have it as a bit of a backdrop to this conversation. It is time for men to tell the truth. Sometimes we feel vulnerable and alone. By admitting this, we are not suddenly exposed to a pack of wild alpha males waiting to laugh in our face. In fact, alpha males feel vulnerable and alone too, but patriarchal culture discourages them from being honest about it. As Grayson Perry eloquently argues, men who feel isolated and alone can do harmful things to both themselves and others. The appalling ubiquity of online sexist and racist abuse speaks of lonely, angry men. If we don't teach them emotional literacy, they might well end up living lonely, unhealthy, shorter lives. Substance abuse, violence, and porn addiction are all side effects of a patriarchal system that conditions the desire to dominate into the minds of young males from as early as childhood. Essential human needs have been systematically conditioned out of males from childhood in the name of creating better competitors. Men become plagued by feelings of isolation because the systemic enterprise of denied contact, humiliation and name-calling, being ostracized, sexist conditioning, homophobia, competition and training for violence leaves boys more and more on their own. This makes it difficult for us to be our true selves, respect our own emotions, build up closeness with all people. Yeah, so bit deep, but in the research I've done, there's a lot of interesting stuff, and I can list a few very interesting men who have like wrote in quite a lot of detail about this. But the first thing I want to ask you lot, just to kick this whole thing off, is what is your definition of masculinity, just so everyone knows where we are.
Definition of masculinity. For me, to be honest, is there's no static definition. I think that there's like a scientific, physical one, but for me that kind of goes into more talking about polarities and general things. So there's negative and positive. That doesn't necessarily mean good and evil in the same way that I think that in terms of I can describe masculine traits that are still intrinsic in women, if you know what I mean. So I think that in terms of the term, it does fluctuate. So is there like, do you want the specific one
what does it mean
for this?
To you? What does masculinity mean to
Because
you?
I suppose for me it's like what a lot of people associate with masculinity just isn't necessarily what I would call it, but there definitely is something that I feel intrinsic inside of me that I associate with being a male. And yeah, so I think that it's kind of one of those semantic things that possibly just like engaging with that as male traits may be negative on my behalf, but as a male, there are certain aspects of my personality that I think come with the gender that I have, other that come from the environment. So yeah, I don't know. For me, yeah, I don't really have a specific definition, to be honest.
Yeah, I would probably agree. I think for me, masculinity, I think everyone who identifies as male or as a man has to come up with that definition for themselves. Like, I don't think it's a one size fit all. I think it's a personal endeavor, and it's I think as men, I think for me personally, I just endeavor to come up with that definition as I get older and mature and grow into, I think, manhood. For me personally, I think I've learned that it's really simple for me. Being a man, what masculinity for me is being responsible, being loving, being kind, being caring, being sensitive, opening up to those who I care about, not being afraid to be vulnerable and to show love. Like, to me, that's really important for me as a man, to be open and honest, and to just be in touch with who I am. And like, I think that probably goes for like people in general. But I think as a man, it's just really important to be in touch with who I am. Ask myself the hard questions that, sometimes you're afraid to get the answers back, and because you're afraid of what the answers might be, and it's just about really like knowing yourself. And yeah, I think that's what I've learned so far personally. I think the people who I've looked at who have really shown me really good traits of masculinity have been my father, my grandfathers. But I think most of them are family men who really care about other people. So that's me.
For me personally, I think the idea of masculinity, well, you guys defined it perfectly. There really is no specific definition. Well, for each person, it is slightly different. But I guess how I like to view it is that on a spiritual level, that we all encompass elements of masculinity and femininity. When you look at it from a scientific perspective, then yes, there is the idea of what it is to be a man. But taking it away from that, I think we're all the exact same. And it's basically a journey of self-discovery. So, the idea of masculinity will be different for everybody. But then again, it comes back to, I guess it really just is how you define it for yourself personally. But again, I see it as really, it's just a makeup of being both masculine and feminine too, because it's a trait that we all have in ourselves. So that's me, really. Yeah. Cool. Hope that helped.
At the risk of repeating anyone, I mean, I think if any of us here gave a dictionary definition of masculinity, it would, to some degree, defeat defeat the purpose of this conversation, because that's not what we're here for. It's like, this isn't a linear conversation. Masculinity and how it manifests throughout your life as a man is not linear, and it's not the same for everyone. And also, I think, for myself, I often think about how, like, quote-unquote movements are started and who the figureheads are for those movements, and then who gets lost within those. And like, I often think about like working class men of colour, particularly men who are faced with poverty and have had no help from any institutions that they've come across in their lives. I often wonder whether they can quite literally afford to have conversations about masculinity or think about identity politics in the way that us 4 or 5 guys here can, and people in the audience can, because to a degree we're privileged. So I guess I often think about how we have to be inclusive within like a movement when it comes to masculinity, and work out how to incorporate the very people that we're talking about, so that they're not lost within the conversation.
And I just want to, just because now I had a little time to think about it, come up with a better answer. So yeah, in terms of masculinity, I think for me the better word is manhood, because masculinity, again, like as we spoke about, there's these traits that are balanced between masculinity and femininity, and obviously if you're raising a child, you can be trying to instill masculine traits in them, but it's more for the outcome of getting like a specific outcome at manhood. So in terms of like defining the difference between manhood and boyhood, for me, I think it's about selfless actions. So that's what I would define it as, but then that also doesn't kind of differentiate between women and male behavior, even though I would say it's still a direct definition of how I would define manhood.
And just quickly, out of interest, do any of you have a response to what that kind of passage I just read out? Because I know I threw in quite a lot of stuff in there. It was a bit...
Yeah, that was deep, bro.
Yeah.
Well, not deep. I don't like when people say that. It was just good. It was good writing, man. Mm-hmm. To be honest, man, I don't remember everything you said, because there was a lot to unpack, man.
I'm so reading my Yeah, I'll pass it round during this discussion to everyone in the audience too. The first question I want to ask is to you lot is about nuances, and I want to be very clear that masculinity and like manhood and the dangers of traditional masculinity, it harms like men of all walks of life, like it can harm men of all races and all cultures and all of that. But what I'm very interested in from you guys is, why do you lot think it is important to account for racial nuance before all men can come together and discuss masculinity?
Ooh, that's a good question. I like that.
Yeah.
So why do you think it's... All right, so I'd say the reason why it's important to deal with the nuance is just all the pressures that we're feeling from the society that we're currently dealing with essentially revolve around like stress and division. And so I would say like the first division that they did is the sex one, but then straight after that you've kind of got the racial divisions. So I would say the reason why it's so important to kind of deal with the nuances is because of how entwined they are, and how the people, or the system that is in place takes into account that nuance. You know, when subliminals are being created, or when actions are being deployed, timings of certain things are coming out, those things will be in consideration. The kind of, just like advertising, when they're doing on the positive side, it's the exact same thing. If anybody's done any form of marketing, those are the exact categories that you break things down into: sex, age, race, all of those sorts of things. And so when you end up trying to create a sense of unity, and I've been in these situations before where you can have really well-meaning, well-intended people, but if that gap isn't there, so if people haven't gone to the stress of like researching people's histories or people's past, that can be on like an individual level of that person who's right in front of you, they've come from another country, do you know what that's like, or as a whole, then you end up basically falling over the first hurdles, because the most kind of obvious tensions and arguments end up manifesting just because of the cultural differences that happen. Just like if you're in a different part of town in a club that you're not usually at, and you kind of rub up against people, even though everyone came to have a good time, the problems just occur. And so, you know, when you've got people who are specifically thinking about those problems that can occur, when you've got people who are specifically saying, all right, cool, what can we put on this T-shirt to rile them up? Do you know what I mean? Like, what can we put in this advert to kind of get a negative conversation going? If you've already had a conversation with somebody about that nuance, it's like, even though it might sting when it gets brought up again, you just like have a foundation. And so I think, just to summarize, I think the reason why it's so important, because that's one of the things that can take it from a reactionary conversation to an actual build.
Yeah, I'll go Vic.
I was going to say, like, even when I think the standards that have been like set for men, like white men and like men of color, are quite different. And even in terms of what we would consider progression as a man, or like being more outwardly confident in terms of displaying feelings and so forth. So often, that high-profile black men, when they're more open and outwardly confident about their feelings, is conflated with arrogance and so forth. So the kind of standards, even when it comes to like quote-unquote progression, are quite different. So those things are also at play. And also, like as Vince was saying, is that the differences that we have as men of color, and not talking that we're a homogenized group. I mean, there are differences between me as a brown man and these guys as black men, or black colorism comes into play and so forth as well. But I think that when you're a white person or a white man, like Vince was saying, is really important. Like, it bears repeating, but like listening and not being, for want of a better term, butthurt when you're called out on something, even though, you know, like, you're well-intentioned, because intentions are all good and well, but when you're used to dealing with what we now call microaggressions, because there's now a language for things like this, when you're used to just experiencing those things day in, day out as a man, then that conditions you, and then that means naturally you have an armor up, and it means that calling people out in and of itself becomes quite exhausting. So, yeah, I'll let somebody else.
Yeah, I think it's important to speak race before you can, I think, progress the masculinity conversation for a number of different reasons. I think one is, not only is race involved, but especially in the UK. So I was born in Bristol, but I was raised in Washington, D.C. So I'm British American. I've had the experience of being a black male in America and in England as well. But especially in the UK, there is also not just a racial divide, but there's usually, being a person of color, an economical divide as well. And that plays a massive factor also in the experiences that someone has being brought up in this country. As a person of color, a country that was never built for you to exist, and a country that was never built for you to prosper, a country that wasn't built for you to succeed. And so all the progress we have as people of color has come from someone dying, someone protesting, someone getting jailed, someone being hurt, someone being threatened. Every right we have as people of color has come from a sacrifice. It hasn't been just the well-intentioned good heart of other people. And so there are a variety of different factors that come into play as a person of color in the Western world, I'll say. With that being said, you know, I agree with everything that's been said. You know, we've been all speaking, we've been meeting up a few times, and there are, you know, and I think the majority of us, I think as we are now in the UK, are in majority white spaces. I think the most of us are, or have been at least. So I've been back in the UK for about 8 years now, and yeah, the majority of spaces I'm in are majority white, and that's a completely contrast to how I was brought up in the States. And so you do recognize the differences, you know, and there is another layer to being a man when you are a man of color, because not only are you dealing with the effects of not being able to fully express yourself as a man, or be sensitive, or be, you know, all these different factors that we all face as men. and especially here in the UK, where suicide is our biggest killer for men for those various reasons. But then you're also worrying about how you're portrayed, you know, even when you're walking down the street, how other people are treating you, the microaggressions, you know, that you have just from walking down the street, the threat that you are to people, and just from the color of your skin, you know, and this unconscious bias. And I say that because I think unconscious bias is not so unconscious, it's your bias, and once you're aware of it, it's not unconscious anymore. And what does that even mean, an unconscious bias? You know, it's a bias nonetheless. So, you know, when you're walking down the street and some people just see black, before they even see you, they just see black. And I'm sure we've all experienced, you know, people, you know, let me check my wallet, let me check this, let me hold my bag, you know, like when you walk down the street, and it's all these things that people, I see almost on a daily basis, people engage with how men of color. But then what do you think that does to people of color who see that? Because we do see that. And what do you think that says? So by you pulling your bag closer, by you checking your wallet, by you doing that, what you're saying is you are a threat. You are not like me. You are unsafe. And so what that does to us, because again, we are conscious of it, what that does to our mental health is different to, I think, someone who is not a person of color or not a man of color. So there's all these different layers that you have to deal with because race is a big issue still, and it's systematic now, and it's very sophisticated. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm not one to point the finger at anyone, and I think definitely, yeah, there has been a lot of issues yes, there is a lot of issues regarding race, but I think a lot of it tends to come from old mindsets that we've all been conditioned into. You know, back years ago, race was a horrible thing. Like, I grew up in Ireland, where there was the likes of, you know, no dogs, no blacks, that kind of racial tension. And I think now we're at a time where we're transitioning out of these mindsets. The fact that we can all be sat here together shows that there is that change. But again, because it's a lot more accessible to have these sort of conversations as before. It's a lot more easier to have these sort of conversations than before, because we have these spaces. We have the likes of social media where, if something happens, you know, it's a lot more accessible to people. You know, we're able to think more for ourselves. You know, the whole idea of things being subconscious is really coming a lot more into our conscious, where, you know, even people that did have biases previously are really starting to see, oh, you know, if I knew this was an issue, maybe I wouldn't have done it in the first place. So even how you mentioned, like, you know, people walking down the street and, you know, pulling their purses away because this guy's a black person. Yes, that is a real thing. But then at the same time, I find, you know, those kind of people, not to say that they're bad or anything, but they haven't been able to be in the spaces to have the conversations that we're having now. Because again, it's still quite a recent thing that we're doing today. So maybe the fact that we're here now, give it, say, even 5 years, less than 5 years, you know, that whole idea of people pulling away their purses is going to be a lot less prevalent, because again, it's really starting to be more expansive to the mind. It's essentially becoming, it's essentially becoming part of the norm to be more open and respectful. You know, it's a more.
Yeah. I don't know if I fully agree with that.
No? Okay.
No, I don't. Well, I'm not sure if I do. I'm still working that out.
No, that's cool. Please challenge me on it.
Before you do that, I just want to ask as well, just because it's good to always back things up with the examples. How do you guys, for example, feel? Do you think you guys maybe internalize when you see the hyper masculinity portrayed in hip hop? I'm not trying to take shots at hip hop, and I don't think we should do that. But how do you think you lot feel? Do you think that perhaps you internalize it? Does it make you feel isolated when you see the sort of hyper masculinity portrayed in? I mean, just to throw out there, just to give context.
No, we weren't laughing at what you were saying.
No, just saying we both want to get in on this.
Yeah. All right.
Well, because firstly, I don't know if I would call hip hop hyper masculine. If somebody wanted to call it some form of toxic masculinity, and that was their phrase, and I don't know what they're talking about, but again, it is a definition thing, but I wouldn't say that hip hop is hyper masculine. I would say, if anything, right now, hip hop is actually quite quote unquote feminine. And if you want to take it on a stereotypical aspect of my value comes in the accessories and, you know, I mean, all those things, again, that's a silly definition as well. But in terms of how I do internalize like all of these things, I think that, I mean, to be fair, I know that Sean Curry's up there, and a very, very long time ago, he taught me how to like see media for what it is. Do you know what I mean? Being able to see the edits and the cuts. So I think that up until the age of, you know, when I was like 8, 9 years old, I think it was all going in directly. I do think it was all going in. It was affecting directly how I felt I had to be out. As in, born in London, and then I moved to Corsica, so very, very different. But in both of those places, whether you're talking about like the concrete urban jungle or kind of out in the middle of nowhere on the side of a mountain, like the hyper masculinity is definitely very a part of both of those societies. So in my mind, I'd gone to 2 very different places, and how men should act, there was like a correlation between it. So there was like a formula being developed in my head, and almost like plans and tactics of how to avoid or deal with situations that was basically like survival tactics. Do you know what I mean? Like how to survive in this situation. But it wasn't just about like physically surviving the environment. It was about what you're saying, like internalizing like what it is that I'm meant to be, and then like how can I get away with actually being myself. You know, but then at a certain point when I realized how media worked for me, then I was able to unpick my own brain and be like, oh, that's actually a fictional narrative that I've digested. Whereas this thing, maybe I do need to explore it.
I guess not everyone has that privilege, though. You've got you're able to do that.
Thing is, it's only timing. So like the information that I got 15 years ago, okay, yeah, but that's all pre-Google. So like now, anybody could have had the same thought and they could find out what I knew right now. So I do think that it's like, it had a lot of value, do you know what I mean, what it is. But I do think that in terms of what you were saying, in terms of the changes now, I think that that's a very big change. So there is, I don't know, I was thinking about it in terms of like the whole people researching who they want to be, you know, because when I was younger, it just wasn't like that. So, and when I was first thinking about it, I was thinking about it like it was kind of like a negative thing, like carbon copy, clone, plastic people, do you know what I mean? Like, oh, this is who I want to be. Today I'm a skater. What are they like? What's the biggest tune? Go and chat the skater talk. And then tomorrow it's like a grime thing. But then in reality, is it that negative that a young person can go online and like research what the avenues are if they end up being a type of person? Because that was the thing when I was younger. That wasn't possible. You just get all of this information on what you should be, and then you're out in the world only getting the reaction from other humans on how you're doing and where you fit into that. So, so basically, long story short, I think that I'd be interested in what the current experience for like someone who is 6 years old now, because there's so much information coming from everywhere, and like, you find what you look for. It's like, how does the feedback loop start? If someone who's only 6 years old has access to everything, it's almost like the first thing they search in terms of masculinity will probably be like a very, will set them on a course, and they're gonna have things like this that might pop up in the feed. So hopefully it's a positive outlook.
Yeah, like on...
Do you remember what you were gonna say, sorry, because I cut you off, or do you want
I think that was beautifully said, Vince. And again, basically, from what I took from what you were saying is basically, it really is down to the individual nowadays to essentially define who it is they want to be. Mm-hmm. And if someone, I guess, decides that they want to have prejudice towards a certain group, then that is down to them. Well, in things like environment, yes, they do have an effect on you. You know, if your environment is telling you you shouldn't associate yourself with so and so person, then you will internalize that. And I guess to kind of combat that, it does come down to having a very strong mental will about you, essentially, to be able to come across that. But for a lot of us now, as you said, for 6-year-old kids, you know, they will be able to like go online and see, okay, is this right, is this wrong? You know, where if you've got a question, you can pull out your phone, go straight onto Google, and you've got the answer right there. But going back to what you said about hip hop, I think the idea of hip hop, again, there's more than one definition to hip hop, and I totally agree. Yes, there have been times in hip hop where we're shown that it is hyper masculine.
Like you personally, and that's kind of the
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
It was personally of you.
I'll get onto that. But I guess the whole idea of the hyper masculine idea of hip hop is more, that's the negative side of that's been thrown out there by mainstream media, So yeah, but for people that look at it from a different perspective, I find you'll see that there actually is a lot of positive in hip hop. If you look at the likes of the London artists that are coming up now, the likes of, I don't know if people have heard of Santan Dave, where they're speaking about issues that are relevant to us as a culture rather than, I want cars in gold. He's speaking about Grenfell Tower, the likes of Stormzy, he's speaking about his mental health and coming out. So I don't know, would you still define that as hip hop being negative or hip hop being positive? And again, for myself coming from Ireland, where, it's still quite a new thing. So I've got a lot of Irish musician friends who are starting to come up now, and they're speaking about, the issues and the struggles that they've had to face. Growing up in a predominantly white country where the idea of being a black man in Ireland is still slowly, it's still a new thing essentially. So the fact that they're being expressive about the issues that they faced, would that be a bad thing? When these guys are saying, my friend got stabbed in the street, it's their situation, that's what they've experienced. So for you that hasn't experienced that, white male, yes, that may come across as negative, but for them, that's real, that's their experience. So I guess the whole idea of, is hip hop hyper, is it negative in a way, is down to the person that looks at it.
I don't know, because I feel like, firstly, I think people are very impressionable. I don't care like how much access to the internet we have. Like I think we're all very, very impressionable, and I think the media knows how impressionable it is, and that's why there's a lot of negative stuff out there. So I'm not sure I quite buy that just because we have access to information, we can just find all the conscious and positive stuff for humanity.
Totally, and as I said,
and I also just want to quickly say as well that I'm highlighting that I'm not taking shots at hip hop as a whole, and I'm saying if there's a problem with hyper masculinity in hip hop, it's not necessarily the hip hop artist's fault. They are part of a culture that has breeded it, and they are part of a culture that's pushed them to that extent, right? Yeah. So what I'm saying, I don't think that we suddenly just they lose culpability basically. But anyway, the kind of point I was trying to say is that as personal black males or whatever, there is definitely an element that when the people who are put in high positions, who look like you, like black males, like for example, you mentioned Santan Dave, he's got a really nice lyric about what about the youths that aren't athletes or rappers, and that's for a lot of young black males, that's all we've had to aspire to for a long time. So just as it pertains to masculinity, I think that's quite an important thing to explore. So
yeah,
I think like,
yeah, go Vix.
Like,
yeah, go.
Sometimes I think within conversations around masculinity and movements, generally speaking, we indulge ourselves in looking at every single aspect of like every single last thing and like breaking it down and analysing it. With hip hop and men of colour, let's say black men listening to hip hop and how much it's influenced them and how they turn out as men, part of me thinks that it's not that deep, because what really, in my mind, affects you as a young man are your material conditions and what you have around you. And so often it comes down to like poverty and people, institutions being there for you. And hip hop, in many ways, I mean, there's a notion that hip hop off late, like Jay-Z released an album last year where it was very much about him opening up and talking about his feelings and so forth. And then there's this notion that hip hop is now moving forwards. But I think it's a really lazy notion, because even within like when in the mid 90s, when it was like when gangster rap was at its height and stuff, like artists like Mobb Deep and DMX were like aggressively exploring themselves and their minds and what they were going through. But because they were not necessarily palatable in the eyes of the media or white media publications, it meant that they didn't gain traction in the way that someone like Jay-Z does, because Jay-Z is this elder statesman who is, through business acquisitions and through his, through the way he presents himself, is now this really, really like, almost like a noble man within hip hop. So when he does something like that, it gains traction, but it's because he is palatable to the masses in many ways, because of the way he's presented himself. But I think people have selective memories when it comes to things like that. Hip hop artists have always been talking about what's going on inside their heads, and whilst the genre itself, you can say it has certain issues in terms of misogyny and so forth. Sure, it has.
Like Hollywood, like everything. You know
But then so does rock music, and so does Hollywood, and so does every other genre. Like increasingly so when we hear about electronic music, like use that as a...
Yeah, but my point is, exactly, but my point is that that's what I'm trying to say about black males is that we, like, whereas white males might have a whole variety and avenue of men, archetypes of men they can aspire to. For us, it's been very narrow in a lot of the time, in mainstream media. So that's my point, innit?
Yeah.
Could you respond to that?
Yeah, I think the question highlights a few different things. First off, I think all of us all of us appreciate hip hop, and I it's not perfect nor any other genre. So I'm not gonna sit here and defame hip hop when we're not up here defaming rock music, when we're not defaming all the other genres of music. Hip hop is arguably one of the most influential mediums in the entire world, potentially the entire history of the last 100 years. If you go to Japan, they're influenced by hip hop. If you go to South Africa, they're inspired by hip hop. If you go to Brazil, they're inspired by hip hop. It's a beautiful thing that our culture created. So I will always stand by it. It's not perfect, and there are some negative aspects to it, of course. Preface to what I'm about to say. I think hip hop, when it comes to masculinity as it pertains to men of color, the reason why hip hop comes up so frequently is because of how it influences how other people view us. Not always just how we view ourselves. Yeah. It's that, it influences how someone walking down the street who does not know me at all thinks I am, and thinks that they know the type of music I'm into, or thinks they know, what I'm thinking. Because
I think as a genre, it's really easy to just ring fence hip hop and say, "Oh, that's the problem for black men."
It's
solely is the problem.
Which is
no, I wasn't like. I think it can be easy to fall into that, and I think I use the term, it's not that deep, but in many ways I don't think it is. I think people enjoy it because there's a rich heritage of hip hop and like black artists and stuff. But if we're talking about things like in Britain, people talk about the problems that black men face in terms of let's say violence and knife crime and so forth. I don't necessarily think that stuff's influenced by hip hop. No. It's influenced, like I said, once again, by material conditions.
I agree.
And so forth. So let's not I think it's really easy to fall into those conversations.
And on that, I think that's a really good point. On that, can we segue? You can still come back. But the kind of next question is, why is it difficult for certain groups of men, and particularly men of color in marginalized community, to perhaps be open and vulnerable and meet this kind of progressive masculinity criteria?
I think it relates back to what we were just talking about. Hip hop highlights a wider issue with how men of color, men of color are represented in the media, full stop, not just in music and not just in hip hop, especially in the British media. Again, growing up in the States, I'm used to seeing, for instance, black men people who look like me as doctors, as lawyers, as professors, as governments, as presidents, as athletes, yes, as anything. I'm so used to seeing that, so I never grew up thinking that I couldn't do something, or that space wasn't for me. There may not have been a lot of people in that space, and there may be just even one, but I never grew up with the idea that, I had to be a footballer, or I had to be, I knew that I was more than that. Now, I said this, when we were meeting up earlier, I'm hyper aware of the privilege that I carry, and to be honest, we all carry a bit of privilege up here on this panel. My experience as a black man I understand is different to someone who maybe was born and raised in St. Paul's and Easton. I completely understand that, growing up in affluent, middle-class, suburban America, so I understand that. But at the same time, too, that privilege has also helped open my eyes and give me a perspective that I think is quite different to what I've found a lot of people of color, men of color in the UK have. Whereas, you literally, in here, you turn on the TV and it's like seeing two black anchor men on BBC is a thing. You're like, wow, like is that? And I'm like, who's that name? I'm like, yo, I'm about to, and no, but I seriously do that. You know, like I'm like, who is that? I'm like, yo, because we out here, like we're making the progress. Like, but that's how rare it is. In the States, that's not the case. You know, and the States has a lot of other issues. Don't get me wrong, but it's this very skewed perception. It's almost comical to me, and it's just like, wow, we're still playing gangsters and we're still playing this. Like that's what people think we are, and it's like. It's laughable. It really is. But yeah, I think the media is the bigger issue here.
Yeah, and I think also like so-called progressive images of black men, particularly like not speaking from personal experience. I'm like a cisgender straight man, but like even queer men of color. At the moment, you see like certain publications within the UK, like ones that are deemed to be edgy, like ID and. A few others of that ilk, and you see on Instagram like the dominant images of progressive queer black men of color being like the kind of image of like black men with like flower rings around their neck and so forth. And I think people often conflate the idea of like breaking down archaic ideas of masculinity around tenderness and stuff. And whilst that is true for, I imagine, a lot of men, that's not always how it manifests, and that's probably not how it always is going to manifest for queer men of colour either. So I think, and then you also have to ask that who's profiting off those images, and like you often have primarily white photographers who are not from like necessarily from working class backgrounds, building their brand of that kind of image, and then I wonder what about queer men of colour who are in their rooms and don't fit into that aesthetic. I think things become aestheticized and then become acceptable, and they become the dominant image, even for what we say are like marginalized communities and so forth. I think things get plucked out and then they become aestheticized, and that means that those things aren't actually inclusive when it comes to people that don't fit into that aesthetic and so forth. And that's indicative of movements like. That's like a wider issue within movements, generally speaking, and how people profit off them, I think. So
I just got to say this because on this hip hop conversation, one you mentioned about how it's the most influential. Like I think they did do a study, and it is like the most influential. They're calling it influential culture that there has been in what we're saying is like recorded history. Because, like you said, you can go into the middle of Korea and they can sing you gin and juice. So you've got like
you can go to Stokes Craft and they'll sing you gin and juice.
Yeah, exactly, same tone, harmonized. So if you've got the most influential culture, and then this is what. You know, Jeremy busted the last one where it's like, well, yeah, it's all well and good saying it's not that deep, but in reality, like how sound physiologically affects the body, like every single thing of it, you've got the most influential culture and you've got all the effects that sounds make. Like obviously it is one of the biggest gearing forces, and like for the last 15 years, it's been, if you've got any brand and you want to get to, if like any new brand that has been created in the last 15 years, will want to target the quote-unquote hip-hop because of the influence that it has. If you can get yourself into that thing, then you're everywhere. If you're talking about headphones, or if you're talking about things that may be unrelated, like bottled water, the fact that it has an association with hip-hop will kind of gear your sales that way. So again, just to kind of keep the conversation balanced, for me, it doesn't make sense to say that it has no effect, because I think it has a huge effect, but in me saying that, I'm not placing any blame onto it. It's just the macrophysical effects of it. So the tunes themselves were created from a certain environment, and so it makes more sense to look at the environment in terms of, okay, so if these tunes are affecting these people, like if we're going to talk about masculinity and people's internal image of masculinity, if these tunes are affecting people's internal image of masculinity, what produced those initial internal images in the first place? And then you end up in the scenario when you spoke about who's making money off it. So you've got the internal images that were created from people because of the environments that they were in, i.e. the people creating the content, and then you also have the people who want to influence society in a particular way. And it's that second part which is where I think the negative aspects really come into play.
Like brand building.
Well, I mean, just the idea of, okay, cool, you know, I'm a label, my friend runs strip clubs. This year we're promoting strippers as a thing. That's what we're doing. Next year we're doing alcohol. Next year we're just going to do crime a little bit more. Do you know what I mean? Like in terms of keywords, and a guy that my favorite researcher.
Harming.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so when people come from those environments and they're like, cool, this is what I've come through. You get the journey, you get the narrative, you get the knit and grit of it. Like more when it's done well, it's entertaining, but you're not thinking this is something that I want to do.
Well, sorry, man.
Oh, no, I'm just going to say, in terms of your question, in terms of why men find it hard to speak about their feelings.
Yeah, especially from marginalised communities, let's say.
I think that.
And also, I just will quickly say
go on.
that if anyone at any point does have questions, do feel free to raise a hand, because like we are definitely not experts in masculinity.
But yeah, I think that in terms of the showing feelings, I definitely like in terms of how that's worded. I wouldn't on that subject draw any correlations on the whole quote unquote race thing. I would say being a black person who's lived in England, I don't know. I didn't grow up with white males operating on an emotional balanced level, being able to speak their feelings or anything like that. So
in that, you're saying there's a similar, there's an allyship in the sense that actually, perhaps like, I don't like labels or whatever, perhaps working class men come into that marginalised category where it's particularly difficult to be open and vulnerable in certain circles.
I wouldn't even say working class. I mean, I went cotton, so I was in Stapleton Road. A lot of people from St Paul's, but just as many people from Clifton, St Andrews, Raglan, and all of that sort of stuff. And there was no correlation between these types of men know how to speak about their feelings and these people don't. So I just think that obviously as we've gone through the conversation, whereas you started off quite wide, I thought on those levels, yes, like you have to contextualize the whole thing. But as you've kind of got more detailed, I think with that particular question, you've kind of hit onto something where it's like, now we're at the core of the issue. Yeah. It is just the core of the issue of like I said, I don't know one society that, isn't quote unquote of a more indigenous nature that doesn't have, on the one hand, a complete sexist outlook, but then also on the other hand, it's almost just as sexist for men. But it's like you get the benefits of the material, but it comes with all of these restrictions. So I'd say because it's universal would be my answer. Because it's universal across the world, that's why it's so hard for men to talk about their feelings, because it's like no matter where you go, that will be the consistent. If you can put the hard front up and be aggressive and be confident, then you might make it in that particular society.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think for the majority of us, we really are coming out of a patriarchal mindset where the man was always the leader essentially of a household, of a group. And in being that, you were always told to be strong, and in that sense, you basically couldn't show feelings and emotion. But I guess the idea of black males having what's it called? What was it?
Masculinity crisis.
Masculinity crisis. Yeah, I think it's definitely a real thing. But then that goes through all cultures as well. I grew up in a community where I was the only black kid in my school for 5 years, and still I'm the only black kid in my entire estate in Ireland. I live in literally smack bang in the middle of Ireland, and I guess for me that was quite a struggle because I didn't have much around me to relate to. But then in that sense too, I was able to see how white males had their struggles. Yes, there are issues that are specific to black men, and there are issues that are specific to Asian men. But then coming together,
unifying thing.
Yeah, there is a unifying thing for all of us as well. So I guess basically what I'm trying to say is, what am I trying to say?
Sorry, man. You can just express yourself. It's
All
fine.
men matter.
It's been a long day.
You're free to express yourself. I think now that we've kind of touched on race and kind of like men of color, now I think we are starting to get to the point where, now these are issues that all men face. And, I work in the men's well-being and masculinity space, and these are issues that white men, black men, Asian men, men who identify as gay, transgendered men, working class men, middle class men, very wealthy men, businessmen, people at uni, everyone is dealing with issues around masculinity and opening up and being vulnerable. I don't think that is tied particularly to marginalized groups. not per se. Like, there may be contributing factors in there. I completely agree with that. Someone, you know, a young guy from St. Paul's Easton may not have the cultural background that I guess facilitates him opening up as much, but then that could be said for someone who lives in Clifton, you know? I think now we are at the space where these are issues that all men face, and now we're talking about male issues, and the idea is around masculinity, and I guess the question to be posed, I would say, is, you know, what prevents us as men, as a community of men, so as the male community, what prevents us from being vulnerable and showing our emotions and being sensitive? Like, what stops us? What's preventing us?
Should we open
Sonia.
it up to a couple of questions in the audience? Got one, two. Got someone running around? Or?
So I'm going to ask you a question quickly. Do you think that, like in terms of men not opening up, do you think that that's more to do with the perception of other men or what men think women will think about them?
I think other men, mostly. I think it's, you know, I think for me growing up, it was always oh, was that open up to the, you opened up to the floor?
No. I was thinking about it, I didn't have an answer.
I don't know. I think it's a mix between, it's between you like, because you want women to like you, and you want to, like, obviously start a family and have a woman, you know, but it's, at the same time too, it's kind of, you want the acceptance of your peers, and this,
yeah.
I think that's what it is.
Very interesting point as well, just from what I've been reading as well, is that actually what patriarchy is so deep that it actually extends to women as well, and there are some women who will, but whether they've been conditioned to or whatever, will actually perpetuate sort of patriarchal masculinity to some extent. So that's a very interesting point. Should we get questions?
I think Sonia had it.
Points?
My name is Sonia. Yeah.
There you go.
And I just wanted to ask you, because that's the reason I'm here on this panel, is so I come from a Polish background, so you can consider questions of privilege, you can consider questions of upbringing, all those things, me as a woman and society and 21st century as well. But I think ultimately what I came here for is to get an answer from you, because of course I've been struggling a lot with, you know, like people I date independently of their race as well. The question of vulnerability is still quite up to date, and how to open up, how to talk about feelings and emotions. And my question for you would be, what can I, as a, you know, 22-year-old white Polish female, however you want to consider it in whatever categories, support you as whatever race you are, wherever you come from and whatever age you are, in developing this healthy masculinity of yours to, you know, what can I do? Because I know there's a problem, like I'm very much aware of that. I do not know how to solve it. So I guess that's what I came here for today, for you to give me some cues.
You got that solution, yeah?
And can I just quickly respond to that? What's so deep about you saying that is that, from what I've just read, is like women have done like loads,
So much, man. So much.
Like, I don't think
I love you,
I don't think
women.
women should bear the brunt of that. Like,
Honestly, oh my gosh.
What would you say? But this is why I
The fact that she's even said that, like, and
yeah, I was just
Let me, I just want to, just on that, before you all start blushing,
go through this.
it's a very interesting point, because in my research I've come across people like Bell Hooks, and essentially, like, there are feminists out there who have highlighted a lot of issues around masculinity, and I feel like actually feminism as a whole speaks to what women have actually done to push a conversation about masculinity. So I think that's one reason why it's so important that men get together and talk about it
man.
in ourselves. But we need to have women as references, do you know what I mean? Because I find actually there's probably something very interesting in the fact that actually, from not being a man and having that external perspective possibly allows you to be able to understand the problem a little bit more. So I think, wider reading is crucial for men of like feminist writers, and one of the things pertaining to marginalised communities is what worries me so much is it's taken me to come to uni to find anything along this kind of lines. Should we go to a couple more questions from the audience? It's got one up there and there was one here. Do you still want to say something?
I was just going to touch on that a little more. I was going to say, like, so often when we talk about toxic masculinity, like, in my mind, more often than not, women bear the brunt of that far more than anyone else.
Yeah.
In platonic relationships and romantic relationships. So, and I think that, like, there's this notion that sometimes that men are underdeveloped emotionally, but to counter that, I think often, especially within romantic relationships between a man and a female, that men are often, when I speak for myself and from past experience, we're often when it comes to talking about things, especially when we're called out and stuff, we're often very much aware of our emotions, but choosing not to engage or actively choosing to disengage, that's a decision a lot of men make. It doesn't necessarily come down to men being emotionally underdeveloped. And I think if you choose to actively disengage from an emotional conversation with your romantic female partner, that's down to you. I'm not sure how much you can expect people to sympathize with you when you're clear about what's going on inside your head, but you choose to just take a step back. I know that seems like a bit of a generalization, but I think there's that at play. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that whilst we're talking about masculinity, let's not give like ourselves as men a free pass under the guise of masculinity and under that conversation. Like even when we were talking about Jay-Z and his album and how he's a high profile example, so I'll use it. How he like cheated on Beyonce and then he made this album where he was like, sorry, rare. He's had countless interviews after, and he's been praised for the progress he's made as a man. He's like deep this, you're a middle-aged man, and now you come, and also you got caught cheating. It's not that deep. You got caught, and now you're talking about it. And him, I think Dan was telling me, him, Kevin Hart, and Chris Rock came together, and it's corny as fuck. Let's be real.
Does that say something about how little tools they have?
From a personal perspective, I've got a friend in here who's such a big fan of Jay-Z. He's probably not going to give me a lift home now. But so if anybody wants to take me home after, I think under the guise of masculinity, let's not let men be shit as well. Like, we got to remember that as well.
Yeah, I just want to
Go on.
I just want to touch quickly on what Sonia said.
We've got opening up question from the audience, opening up to teenage boys as well. How can we expand on what she said?
Open up to teenage boys. So women are incredible, and I'm not just saying that because I'm on a panel in front of a bunch of women. Women are honest. Women are absolutely incredible. You know, the majority of my friends growing up were girls. I think they always kind of had been, I always admired and really respected women from watching my mother and just watching the incredible, I was inspired by, Whitney Houston and Princess Diana before I even knew who Jay-Z was. And that's just me as a person, I think I always had that admiration, and it's funny that Sonia says that because, I work with different charities, and one in particular that deals with male suicide, and I have not met one male person that works at that charity that helps prevent male suicide. And that just speaks to just the compassion and the power and just the absolute just like wonder of women, because they are just continually putting themselves forward and trying to help us deal with issues that a lot of men can't even deal with themselves. And so I think that just has to be said. And I completely agree with what Vic said. We don't get a pass just because it's like, oh, he's a man, he doesn't know how to, he doesn't know how to express his emotions. To a degree, yes. I think there's different things at play there. Yeah. First of all, there's understanding recognizing your emotions, understanding them, and then articulating them. So it's a process, and a lot of guys don't necessarily have that language or have that intelligence to, I think, act out that process. But that doesn't mean they should get a pass. But also I think as culturally, a lot of men aren't in that space where they can do that. So I think it's like, don't give them a pass. I definitely don't believe in give them a pass.
I think there's a nuance there, and as an extension of that, like I've heard. I've heard a couple on social media. I've heard a couple of women talking about how. I've heard a couple of women talking about masculinity and how they've kind of just said like, miss me with the conversation around masculinity, as in like, I'm not interested. And I think it's important for us as men to remember that if you hear a woman saying that, don't get butthurt and take that person. Just understand that like women done been having the conversation about men and masculinity for generations. Yeah. Probably before we have. So if they're exhausted by it and they want to take a step back, don't get butthurt and be like, oh, you are part of the problem, because they are not part of the problem. Like, the problem is within men ourselves, I think, generally speaking. So I think
let me get to say because I think I agree with what everyone's saying, and so I won't reiterate it, but 110% on all of that raised by women. I'm only here because of it. But in terms of something that specific, like in terms of what you can do, one thing that I think is very important is on an individual level is women being honest about what it is that they find attractive and communicating that with the males around them. I know that when you're getting into something romantic, it might be weird in terms of the timing, but in terms of all the other males, and the reason why I think that's so important is I think we fluctuate we fluctuate between the information that goes inside of our head as a theory and then how we see the environment and the world working practically. So I can be around loads of conscious women who, they say all these really amazing, powerful things, they give me life, but then I also see the reaction when the guy comes through, he looks like he's worth like $500,000. So then that's gonna be something that goes inside of my head and it's gonna change my actions. Whereas if you had like an honest conversation, you were like, oh no, that does gas me a bit, but here's where it is on my value scale, and then I can also internalize that as a young man and say, all right, cool. So it does mean something, but it doesn't mean enough for me to say go and start drug dealing. Now, this goes in all other aspects as well. Like you can talk about the physical security that a woman may or may not want from a male. Now, if that is something that does mean something to you, if you don't say anything and then suddenly you get a guy who's nuts and he's crazy and he's just completely like mentally not what you want to go for, but then on that aspect he hits, and then you've got another young male saying, well, you said all this stuff about this thing, but then he come through and I'm smart enough to know the reason why that's attractive to you is because of this. So now I'm going to go and do something wayward. So again, everything said beforehand, it's not your issue. You've been doing stuff for like hundreds, thousands of years. But if there's something small, it's about being really honest with yourself. And again, it's the same thing when we were defining masculinity. It's not about you defining whether everyone should care about money or whether everyone should care about security. But if it's important to you, communicate that to the people, the men around you, because you're in a similar environment, and then at least allow them to make like the conscious choice to be like, I'm going to get a new job and learn Kung Fu, you know?
Let's go to some more from the audience, please. One back there.
Hello. A couple of things I wanted to say. So first, in terms of black men and feeling, just right now I feel really good, and because it's 5 black men on the panel, I feel involved in this conversation in a way that I normally wouldn't feel, so that's really good. And the second thing is a bit of a plug, but also a direct answer. I think as women, the thing you can do is you can ask that man, have you got a male friend that you could talk to about this? And if you haven't, why not? And leave them to reflect on that. Because if you haven't got a male friend that you could talk about these things with, that kind of shows that our culture is broken and that maybe you need to reflect on your male friendships and start trying to slowly build that friendship and build that bridge. And that's where the shameless plug comes in. So I work in several men's groups, so if anyone wants to speak to me about that, speak to me afterwards. And then the last question that I had is, do you think, so there's this idea of progressive masculinity that's out there, and so I'm going to define that progressive masculinity as a man who does yoga, can cry at the movies, and goes to the film. So that's a progressive masculinity, which I think isn't as accessible to black men or men of color, because we don't see black men of color doing that. When we see that, often it's in comedy fashion. If you see a black man with lots of muscles crying in a film, it's comedy. And I think what I'm hearing from the panel is that do you think that's progressive? Is that a progressive masculinity?
I don't think this...
Crying?
Let's get some more questions and we'll come back. Yeah,
Okay.
we'll do a little if we're that fast. Do you want to just throw it across the room? Just dash it over there. Just be on the things, Bill, not us.
Oh yeah, thanks for doing this panel, and I just wanted to comment on how young everyone is in here, which I think is a positive thing, first of all.
Very positive.
But my question was, so when you were defining masculinity, you were kind of looking for words that, to me, meant self-aware. And in the future, do we even need masculinity as an idea? Do we need to move away from it? And is it actually better to then start just thinking about ourselves as people rather than these gendered terms?
You go to university, I can tell.
Someone's been waiting for a while, I think.
Hi. So I just really like the themes that you were talking about vulnerability specifically, and I've been reading quite a lot about it recently, and then there's this notion that a big barrier to vulnerability is shame. And I really understand feeling that as a white woman, but I just wanted to know how for you guys, you have, like, what your experiences of shame would be, and if you do feel like it's a barrier to vulnerability.
Maybe you can just touch
So you hold on the question?
Yeah, you can answer it.
because I think the reason why I wanted to touch on that one is it goes back to what you were saying, the point I think you were getting at when you first mentioned the hip-hop. So for me, when I was growing up in London, I feel like there's always something that kids find about people, and that's the thing that they try and pick on. For me, when I was younger, it was being smart, but because, I don't know, for me, I always wanted to be the smartest anyway, so that I just kind of went with it. But that definitely was the thing where there was definitely scenarios where I'd feel like, okay, this is where I need to tone it down a little bit. Do you know what I mean? This is where, and it was because of the aspect of shame. And I think for me, the thing that completely dispelled that is when I got enough information about history to the point of finding out where maths was invented and where science was invented and all of those kind of things. And then that's what gave me my intrinsic kind of anchor into just not budging from that square. Because before then, you know, being a black person in England and then kind of getting this stigma as the smart thing, the thing that was associated with it that made it the shameful thing, which is that you're acting white. That's what the shame was. It wasn't that you're smart and we don't like smart people. It's you're smart and that's a white thing to do. So so that's where I completely understand what you were getting at with that hip hop thing, because I went to Washington DC and I had a complete spin out moment when I was in a black club and I was talking to one guy and I said something and whatever it was, he was like, oh no, everyone in this club is either a lawyer or a doctor. It looked like every other black club I've ever been to, but with Americans. Yeah. I'd never been in that scenario before. Yeah. Like, I really soaked that in. I was like, wow, I'm in a black middle class environment. Like, it just, to me, I never even knew that existed. Do you know what I mean? So it'd have been completely different growing up, seeing all of those things, because then certain things don't make sense. Like, you can't say that somebody's acting white for being smart when you're surrounded by loads of smart black people. Yeah. Do you know what I mean?
I think that plays into what it means to be a person of color in the UK. Yeah. Because you're not seeing that spectrum and breadth of black people. Mm-hmm. You know, the university I went to, with all my lecturers, all my professors, every faculty member, and 98% of the population at my university was black. Crazy. You had the emo black kids, you had the rocker black kids, you had the theater black kids, you had the jock black kids, you had the nerd black kids, you got the whole spectrum. So then coming here, and again, I consider that a privilege. The older I get, I consider that more of a privilege. But you know, it's like now I come to UK and I just see this very narrow spectrum, and it's like I gotta be Mandem or I gotta be a footballer, and it's like that's just not speaking to, you know, or I gotta really engage with I have to really engage with grime, or I have to really engage with this because that's what it means to be black man in the UK, and it's I don't subscribe to that, and I think I just endeavor to really help to broaden the breadth of men of color in the UK, because I have that perspective. And just quickly, I want to just speak on a little bit what you were saying. I think the same thing with you is being smart. Like, my thing growing up was being vulnerable and sensitive, because I was always more sensitive to a lot of the other guys. And I didn't really have a problem with that. Other people had a problem with that, because they were just like, all right, you're a faggot, you're gay, and all this. And that highlights the issues of homophobia within the male community. Because it's like, as men, we never want to be perceived as gay. We never want to be perceived as soft to other guys. Yeah. So we're always trying to defend and protect our masculinity at whatever cost. And so my whole thing was like, all right, I'm really in touch with, at 7, I was just really in touch with my emotions and really in touch with my feelings. Again, most of my friends were girls, so we would just sit down and have chats. I would chat to my mom, I would chat to my aunt. Seriously, I was like 7, making cups of tea with my mom, and we would just chat, and we was like, yo, this is what's up. And so, like I said, when I say I have really good relationships with women, I mean, I genuinely mean that. Both my parents are together. I had a dad in the house. He's been an absolutely amazing image for me as well. But I've always connected with that, because at that age, guys aren't really that sensitive. Women are open and talking. So for me, it was about me being sensitive. And I think as now I'm 28, and my journey has been getting me to be okay as a man and being sensitive, because actually sensitivity is a massive strength. And I work with men now who are in their 30s and 40s who literally just cannot connect. And they're, you know, and I'm just like, wow, it's again another privilege that I can connect, and I'm not ever gonna fight that. And I think it's this whole thing of if you're sensitive, then it's like you're crying at the drop of a hat, and it's not that. It's being sensitive just means being able to connect with other people, man. One of the biggest blessings I have in my life are the deep connections I have with other people, and I would not have that if I was not as sensitive and vulnerable and kind and caring in person, you know. And all those things that I got made fun of that have put me in a variety of different mental health issues growing up and issues around masculinity. I'm so thankful that I am the way I am, and now I'm just so proud of it. And so again, it's helping more men to find that freedom. You don't have to fit into this box. You can be whoever you want to be, and you don't have to act a certain way because of your gender, because of your race, because of whatever. You can just be who you are, and just right now, just release all of you guys into freedom to be who you are, and just let go of the labels and let go of what all the society's trying to condition you need to be like. You know, it's okay, and it's just all good. And I just want more people to feel like that.
My answer is yes to your question.
Yeah, dude, that was beautiful, and I think that's how I try to live my life. This whole idea, basically, there's a thing I follow called a map of consciousness, which basically shows you the different levels that we come in at. So starting at shame and making its way up to enlightenment. And I think really that, yes, we should break these boundaries down. How you mentioned, will we need to even talk about masculinity in the future? I think not so much have it as a label, but more understand the history behind it, just as we look back in history and we see, the impact the Egyptians had, how we're all here today as well, but be able to step away from these labels and be more collective, essentially. So I definitely think that's where we should take ourselves, 100%.
I just remembered from the last time we did this panel, there was something that was in my mind, and it's kind of reflecting what you were saying about should we just get rid of the masculinity thing? And instinctively, as you said it, I was like, no. Just like, no, that doesn't make sense. I've just been thinking like, okay, what is it? So after the last panel we had, the whole definition of masculinity thing came up, and I was thinking about it, and for me, it's almost like, okay, so if in my head I'm just going to generalize for everybody, and if we generally say that women have been doing a lot to help men, almost all that they can do, and if we generally also accept that there is a problem which stems from men and stems from masculinity, then that space that we're talking about, that's actually what I define as masculinity, like that change that needs to be made. And that's the reason why I don't think you can lose not only the term masculinity, but in terms of the specifically identifying something that men have to do that women don't have to do. Because if women have already been doing everything they can and there's a change that needs to happen in men, then that's what we're going to have to address. Now, once it's addressed, and on the other side of it, I still feel like I would personally still retain the ideas of masculine and feminine, but on the other side of that, I think there's a viable conversation in terms of not really needing it. But I think that just like when people talk about quote unquote reverse racism and like the kind of the semantics of going down that route when you try and blanket over as like, oh, everyone can get a type of this and everyone, it's the same thing that I think happens when you try and actually take masculinity or take femininity out of the conversation, because there is a physiological base for it. So no matter what we choose to call it, there's like something physical which is rooted in, which will manifest in different ways. And I think that obviously what we need to do is concentrate on the negative manifestations of it rather than trying to eradicate it, because I think that some of the problems in the extremes come from trying to eradicate it. So I feel like, again, going back to the hip-hop example, I think that actually what you see in quite a lot of recent hip-hop acts is a rebellion against having to be masculine. So I think that's actually what you're seeing, and that isn't positive either, the way that it's coming out. So yeah, that's what I would say on that, is that the space for progression that men need to take, if you take that as a definition of masculinity, then it's something that needs to be concentrated on rather than ignored.
More than anything, I think it's an attractive notion. Let's throw masculinity in the scrap heap, and trust me, in an ideal world that would be great, right? Like for all of us men, we wouldn't have to think about it, we wouldn't have to worry about it, being men. But also, I think I just think it's just a notion itself. That's all it is, I think. Being able to throw something in a scrap heap, because we can theorize now and talk about, let's, for argument's sake, you say that we have thrown it away and masculinity doesn't exist as a concept. When we go back to our day-to-day lives, trust me, it exists. Mm-hmm. And that's always going to be the case. That's not to say things can't move forward and we can't become more self-aware and stuff, but in some form or another, I think, like Vince was saying, it's going to exist. And I think it's about looking at things from a realistic perspective and not necessarily being let's theorize about what are sometimes fanciful notions, without being disrespectful or anything. But we're all guilty of that because we want to live in maybe almost alternate realities, where certain things that are deeply problematic, inherently problematic, don't exist. But in our day-to-day lives, on ground level, something things like masculinity and I'm not sure if you can just throw it in a scrap heap. How does that even manifest?
Yeah, definitely not at all to throw it away. I don't think that's even possible, because considering You know, the fact that all of us are all from completely different places, so we're all going to have different ideas of what it is to be a man. We're all going to have different upbringings, different cultures that we're brought up in, even though we may be quite similar. You know, but again, that's where we engage in conversation. You know, we aim to understand each other's different ideas and perspectives of what it is to be a man, what it is to be a female. And from there, we can break things down. You know, there's always going to be tension between people. Like if you even look at the States, where they're like, oh, these black guys, or the police are doing this. You know, it's all different situations for people, and it does just come down to understanding. But that's where you need to engage in that conversation to break it down. So it may not be as prevalent. It will always be there, but it won't be as prevalent as it is. There won't be as much negative reaction towards it.
I think there's nothing wrong with masculinity at all, and I don't think there's anything wrong with the notion of it. I think I've been in different discussions where people are like, let's get rid of femininity, let's get rid of masculinity, and let's just be in this glorious utopia of like non-labels. I don't think that's the answer, and I don't think that's what we should be really aiming for. I think personally right now, I think what needs to happen right now in the male community is more men need to be supporting other men. Mm-hmm. And we really need to come together, and we really need to help each other to, I think, understand who we are and free each other to be who we are. And I think that's what's the best thing we can do for women, the best thing we can do for the LGBTQ plus community, the best thing we can do for everyone outside the male community who's affected by how we act, mm-hmm. is to better ourselves. That's it, man. And I think, we have all these people who are trying to help us and support us when I think right now men have got to come together and really support each other. And I think there's a distrust between men in the male community. I know, this is something recently, not to plug Marcus's group, but I've been doing some personal development in one of his groups, man. But one of the things I realized is actually, for a long time, because of how I was brought up and being bullied by mostly guys, there's a massive distrust I've built up between other men. So even on a level, it's like I'm cool, but there's a deepness in me that's like, I don't trust this guy. I don't. And it's just because I've seen a lot of how we act with each other and what we do to each other when we find differences in each other. But I think right now what we have to do is really just start coming together, man, and just stop holding each other to this very narrow perspective of what masculinity is.
As an extension of that, I think it doesn't necessarily mean in support looks like us necessarily always hugging each other and saying, I rate you. It's also about calling each other out when we're doing shit things.
You've got to challenge each other, and I think that's what is missing right now. There's not enough men speaking up against the negative aspects of the male community. It shouldn't take women to come up, and saying, me too, I've been sexually harassed. I've been if guys don't see that there's an issue with that, then that highlights a variety of other issues there. And
just to add on to that, I think that in terms of this coming in and supporting each other, one thing to not underemphasize is the person. So say there's somebody who's going through something. Generally, when you're talking about men supporting each other, you think of the idea that you have the person who's quote unquote being victimized and they need a support group around them. Yeah. But in fact, a couple of days ago, literally one of my friends phoned me up. He's not in Bristol, having a general chit chat. About 7 minutes into the conversation, he was like, "Oh no, to be fair, I'm actually not doing too well. I've been depressed and and he kind of offloaded on me, and he'd been doing a specific thing of calling his cool friends and telling them that. And that's when I realized actually quite a lot of the energy and the emphasis is on you if you feel like you have the issue to put yourself out there. Because, a lot of us are lucky enough to have a friend that we can talk about something to. And when he phoned me to say that, he knew I wasn't going to take the piss. Yeah. He knew I wasn't going to joke about it, but it was still an energy and a stretch for him to make that conversation, and it helped him just doing it and hopefully the conversation that we had. So I think that just as much as, because it's almost it's still the male superhero mode that we're in, I need to go and support, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go, but actually quite a lot of it is about when you're feeling vulnerable, making sure that you take the same advice and then go and seek the support at that moment. Because I know for me, being that I've been teaching people since I was 9 years old and that kind of stuff, the supporting side is kind of what comes a bit more natural. But But in terms of the talking side, that's just what never happens. You know, but even as my friend was talking to me on the phone, I was like, this is deep, you talking to me, because I feel like I agree with you, but I'm still in the mode of ignoring it because I got stuff to do this month. Do you know what I mean? So that's kind of what I took from it, is like, yeah, as much as you're thinking about the supporting nature, or when you're in that vulnerable moment, that's when you'll really be tested, you know?
Yeah. We started a bit late, so we can just run over a little bit. You wanted 2 points? If that's okay with everyone.
Hi. Do you think that the suggestion of a strengthening and growth of the male community acts as a double-edged sword, in the sense that whilst we're seen to be growing the male community and arguably the male ego, feminism is then being lost in the process, because it's the very kind of breaking down of the male community that has allowed feminism to kind of have the outreach that it's been able to establish over the recent years.
And then another point as well. Do you want to say something? And just quick show of hands if anyone else wants to say anything, just so we can like collect to a few in a bit. All right.
Hi. So I grew up in rural South Devon, which basically equates to, it was very, very rare that I would ever see a face that wasn't white. So I do have that gap in sort of experience interacting with people of other cultures and other racial backgrounds. So coming now to university, where I am exposed to that more diverse network of people, I guess my question is, what is important to remain aware of and be respectful of when trying to branch out and when trying to support other men of different racial backgrounds of myself?
Can you just give it two, just because I forget the questions?
Yeah, we'll respond to them, and then we'll just be ready to get the others, if that's okay with you guys.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing, and thank you for being here. I think, I think the great thing that Mandem and Elias, you've done is help create a space where it's a safe space for people to engage and to educate themselves, and that's what's needed. Because people that come, for instance, someone like yourself who comes from a rural background, and you're saying you haven't engaged with a lot of people of color. That's okay. That's not any fault of your own. That's nothing to be ashamed of at all. And you being here, you're trying to educate yourself. So I thank you for just being here. So the question was how you can further understand or engage with the community or understand the challenges.
Yeah, how to respectfully approach those questions.
Mandemhood.com. Spaces like this is great. I think for me, and what you're describing, everyone has to some degree. So just because I'm a person of color doesn't mean that I don't know. I fully engage with every single aspect of every different race and every different, I'm very intentional. I know some people may think this is right or wrong, but I'm very intentional sometimes. I'm like, all right, I look at my circle of friends, I'm like, all right, not enough Asian people, like I need to, no, I'm straight up, some people may think it's wrong and some people may think it's right. It's fine. I'm like, all right, well I'm like, okay. And I don't use them for that. I just let it happen organically. But it's like, I'm conscious of like, all right, actually right now, I don't have any friends that are close to me that are openly gay. I don't have anyone who's particularly transgendered. I don't have anyone, and I'm like, okay, cool. And I'm conscious of it. I don't go like, all right, I need to go find my Asian friend. I need to go find I don't. But I'm just like conscious of that. I'm just conscious of it, and I'm like, okay, cool. Because then when I come across those people, I'm like, all right, cool. This is great. This is amazing. Because I want to understand more myself. Like for instance, Vix. We've been having some very candid conversations about the differences between the Black and Asian community, because it's like I've known Vix for almost 8 years now, and it's like I want to understand more about the issues that the Asian community are facing, like what it's like to be an Asian man in society today. Because right now, how I get treated at the airport and how Vix gets treated at the airport are two completely different experiences. And we're still men of color, but we're still experiencing different things. And unless I ask him, and unless I'm intentional about finding out what are the challenges that you face as an Asian man, and I actually just said that. I mean, we were speaking this with you. I just said that verbatim. Like, what are the challenges that you face as an Asian man? I think sometimes what we do is like we may maybe in Bristol we're around so many different groups of people, but how much are we engaging with these people? How much are we asking them, what is it like? What are the challenges that your community faces? And I'm just someone who's very intentional about that. I just ask the questions, and because I want to know, so I can better myself, but also be aware of what other people are facing.
And
so
cool. And can we go to the man up there? Not to neglect your question. I just think about feminism. I think that actually requires a whole discussion. I think, and I wouldn't want to relegate it to just a quick answer thing, because I think that's a wider issue, and I'm quite keen on making the next event.
I think, put simply, though, sometimes men would be better off staying quiet around feminism and not trying to be quote-unquote woke. Stop trying to be the devil's advocate. If you're going to lead, if your first response is going to be "but," then you're the problem, right?
Yeah.
Simple as.
Yeah.
And I would just say, change yourself.
In many ways, but it's more nuanced.
By doing that as well, we can't isolate. Like, there's social conditioning at work here. Do you know what I'm saying? Like the men, like the alt-right or whatever you want to call them. Like this Grace and Perry quote that's interesting. The appalling ubiquity of online sexism, racist abuse speaks of lonely, angry men. Like at the end of the day, I think that's a key thing as well, and that's why I think it's important to not necessarily dismiss men who say suspect things and are negative towards feminism. I think it's about understanding the context behind that and how they've been socialized to think that way. And I think it's just hard work. I think it's hard work having these conversations.
But the rise of women doesn't have to be the downfall of men.
Yeah, of course not. And that's why let's keep that to like.
I mean that's a whole other thing. But yeah.
From 1, 2, we'll go first.
I think, so obviously you've been talking about in this discussion how a lot of women really support the male community in emotional needs. And I've been talking to a lot of male friends recently who've been saying that they can have very emotionally articulate conversations with their female friends. But when it comes to having those conversations with their male friends, they still really struggle. And it's like you were saying, you still feel those barriers of communication with your male friends, even though you know that you have this very emotionally articulate response to your own emotions. And I guess my question is, what do you think we can do, because it's a systemic problem, to help young men find ways so that as they grow up into being adult men, to not feel those barriers anymore?
Just on the super quick one, just to go, I just think it's the similar answer that I gave before, because I think that in a lot of different things, it's always very easy to kind of theorize what either your future self or what other people should do around someone. So in terms of that, I think it's just about, so if you're talking about you and a certain group, it's about just making the males in those individual groups participate in the behavior that you think is productive. Because I'm talking about me as an example, it's easy for me to explain how something should be, and then for me, in terms of this issue, I'll just go and work off all my emotions, days, weeks on end, and never really deal with it. So that's what I would say. It's like your male friend who you're talking to in that circumstance, further that conversation to the point where he takes that action with another particular male, and then in that way you've done something directly to somebody that you care about. But then the main thing is at a point when a younger generation sees that as a norm, they'll get a different programming. So no matter what happens, we're going to feel the grind and the friction, and it's going to be weird. But I think the only real cure is creating a new foundation, like you were saying in terms of the examples, like when young men see loads of different options, then they pick, and then they'll do with what feels intrinsically right, which, I can't imagine, all of the pressures that we've currently dealing with, they're not very natural. They just make sense in reality. So that's what I'd say.
Sorry, thank you so much. I think it's such a brilliant panel, great to see so many people kind of really engaging in the conversation. I don't mean to speculate on anyone on the panel's sexuality, but it has seemed, and as no slight, it's a very heteronormative conversation in some senses. And not to slight you at all, I just wondered, given that, from my own experiences in a lot of queer communities, the way in which masculinity is often shaped is in a way kind of through homosocialization, so your relations to other men. And particularly when you look at a lot of queer communities, there is a lot of racism and a lot of sexism. It's still contained within it. So you have, people will in the same sense that you had no blacks, no Irish, and dogs, people with very much no femmes, and very white people only, and they have this very specific kind of version of what they see as attractive masculinity. I didn't know if you had any thoughts on how we can within queer spaces and within things really begin to challenge the kind of the anti-feminization narrative as well as the racialized narrative, because you have this very sort of like congratulatory masculinity which forms itself around an idea of like the idealized certain form of man, which is in terms of sexual desire is one thing, but at the same time is on a double-edged sword of like is anti-women, and then further like is anti-people of color.
All right.
I think, like, as a heterosexual man, as a cisgendered heterosexual man, is for me so much. It's not so much that I don't want to speak about the queer community, or it's just that I'm not representative of it, and I don't feel like I'm necessarily qualified to make any real statements with a great deal of conviction. But I'm open to listening, and I understand that this conversation has been quite heteronormative, I think. And from what I've gathered, knowing these guys, I don't think it's necessarily because we're reluctant to have that conversation about the queer community. It's just that none of us may feel particularly qualified to have that conversation. But that's not to say it's not important. And I think, like, for us guys as panelists and Elias running the panel, it's always something that you take on board, and you keep it moving for like the next panel that you do, and maybe you get somebody on the panel that is more representative of that community, so that kind of dialogue can be opened up. But I'd be reluctant to necessarily comment on that. But I didn't comment on about how like queer men of color are like aestheticized, and how their image is like kind of like circulated, and people build their brands off it and stuff. And I understand. I've spoken to like friends in queer communities and how like racism is a huge problem and stuff. So
I think some of what you're talking about, even though I don't think any of us are qualified to speak on behalf of the LGBTQ plus community, not being a part of it, but I think some of what you're talking about is just masculinity as a whole as well, though, from what I'm gathering. And again, this is what goes back to like having people in your circle. You know, I live with a 13-year-old gay boy and his family, and again, just speaking to more people within the LGBTQ plus community is really important. And I just tell everyone out there, it's really important to speak to different people about the issues that they face, because that's how we gain understanding. And so I think what you're talking about is, yeah, it's true. It's like we have to I think what we have to do is we have to let go of these boxes of like, all right, if you're a man, you can act like this, you can act like this, you can act like this, and it be okay. And then these other boxes is like, you're going to be labeled a faggot, you're going to be labeled gay, whether you are or not, doesn't matter. You're just going to be labeled these things. And we just have to, again, it's about just freeing men up. And I think men and women have to do this. We all have to do this, or however you identify. We've got to free men up to be who they are. And I think until we do that, we're always going to run into this thing of like masculine, feminine, he's too feminine, he's too masculine. It's like that whole thing. And so, I mean, you have to, I think, just let that, we have to start letting that go. But again, even heterosexual men, we've got to let that go for each other. So it's like, just because the guy's acting a certain way, we can't just be labeling him as gay, just because over 60% of gay men experience suicidal thoughts and depression in this country right now. So that highlights a massive issue of, right now, it's still a negative, in my opinion, as the society to be gay. And I think we can all say it's a great thing, and all the companies want to change their flags to the gay flag when it comes down to pride and everything like that. But still, the reality is, it's still viewed as a very negative thing in a lot of communities. And so until we start opening up these conversations and to start allowing, men and women and however you identify to be who you are, and to really engage with these communities and actually understand what the challenges are, as the gentleman is shedding some light on, we're always going to be back at square one. It's
also,
the same thing with race.
As we speak about communities as well, I find we've all been speaking about communities and using the word community, me included, and I think within that, like, we've got to be careful to remember that, like, no community, so to speak, is a homogenized group of people, really, and you've got to take into account the complexity and nuance of experience within that. So I'm repeatedly said the queer community, and as I was thinking, I was like, that is me homogenizing that community, because, well, there's a great deal of complexities, like, within.
I mean, so intersections. It's like
Intersection.
it's
Yeah,
like
it's
you're
all
black.
very
If you're
intersectional,
black,
I
you're
agree.
gay,
Yeah,
you're feminine. It's like all these different things, you know. That
And
add up.
just to like, this is going to be the similar point that Dom made last time and beforehand, because I think like in terms of that conversation when you're talking about, you know, the LBGTs and then the black communities and masculinity, again, completely underqualified, and it'd be nice to have it bounce back. But for me, something that I've been made aware of is that, especially when it comes to defining how black masculine people act, say within Caribbean communities or Africa, there's this notion that we're kind of X times more homophobic, and that, you know, and this all comes down to how we see masculinity and those sorts of things. So I would say that it's more of what you're saying, the roots of the definitions, because like you said, the label, from what I've seen, the negative label that a gay person would get in terms of other men defining the masculinities in the areas that I grew up are the exact same labels that somebody who's not gay would have got for displaying the same traits. So it's like, are we talking about the traits that somebody displays in terms of their balance of masculine or femininity, or the actual act of being gay? And so that's the thing, the actual act of being gay is something that I can't speak on, but in terms of the act of people being judged by how they act, it comes back to the same issue, that whether you were gay or not, if you acted in that certain way, that's when you get pressure, which is why I know road people who were gay who were still out and about, because in terms of the other masculine things, you know, the violence, and they still participated in that. So therefore it was okay. So the root of the problem's still there, even though they are technically a gay person thriving in an environment that other people would think was pretty hard to.
So is that not an attack on femininity? Like, because I have a notion, and I don't know how true this is and how people may agree, people may not agree. But I think in a lot of cases, as men, we're actually taught to hate women in a lot of different spaces, in a lot of different ways, because we have this thing about like really holding on to this idea of this really like narrative, slim, I think, narrative of masculinity, and anything outside of that we want to attack so much. So why are we attacking feminine attributes so much? Like, why is that such a big
master plan? No, I hear what you're saying. I think what you're saying about homophobia and stuff, I think as you unpick patriarchy and you look further into it, you kind of begin to understand how things like homophobia are kind of a natural result of it. And I think, as we've all discussed, I think the intersectionality is very important, and to understand how patriarchy is tied in with capitalism, it's tied in with racism, it's tied in with everything. And I think, it's definitely not an easy task deconstructing these things, but I think it's very important that we do so. So thank you all very much.
I was just going to be like, I think if anything, we definitely need to take a more emotionally intelligent stance to one another in terms of understanding, because in that way I find that's where discussions are going to be a lot more easier to be had. You know, so again, from my growing up, where I never really had this sense of belonging because I was always the only black kid. But I never actually viewed myself as a black kid. I was just a person. So in that sense, I experimented with different things to understand, okay, is this who I am? Is that what I'm supposed to do? Because I never had any real idea. So I've been with guys, I've been with girls, and it's like from there again, it's always down to, if you really want to know something, it really is just down to asking. So as you said, you know, the fact that you're from rural Devon and you don't have you wouldn't really know what to say to a black person or to a person of color. I guess it really is just down to asking what it is that you'd like to know. And to be honest, it's always going to go back to them if they're willing to answer that question. How willing are they to be open to you? You know, so it's always a two-way conversation. Yeah, we can be like, oh, this dude said this, so that means he's a racist. But if that black person, say, reacts in a negative way, yes, I can understand, you know, there's a lot of issues that we've gone through systematically as well that does make it a lot harder for us to answer these sort of questions. But it really is down to how willing and open you are to engaging in these sort of talks and these sort of conversations. So again, that's why I say emotional intelligence. If you can see that they're being riled up, I guess it's down to you again to change your approach. There's always a way to work around people. But again, it really is just down to understanding, trying to put yourself in their shoes, as well as being able to take yourself out of it too and say, okay, look, this is how this thing works and that's how it should go.
And what we'll do is I'll put like the emails of these guys up as well, so everyone can like keep it going and whatever. And we'll try and do another event very soon. But can I say a big thank you to Arnolfini? Can we thank the panel as well?
And just a massive big thanks to Elias, man. You're doing an amazing thing. Honestly, so good.
Yeah, feel free to come chat to us or whatever. We'll be hanging around a little bit, I imagine.